So it somewhat feels like I have to lecture or make a presentation, and the presentation is based on a textbook that's written by somebody else, and I have to give you some kind of exegesis on what was written. I shall try. I think the advantage is that we did speak for an hour yesterday. Our ideas are very similar at a personal level on the topic. I think you will find that as the presentation unfolds, you might suspect that Prof. Grayson and Prof. Baba had a conversation. They might have had a conversation, but I don't think so that they have planned the presentations as such, because what's about to unfold, you would see, really reinforces what's been put into the plan. And I think that's just a coincidence, and perhaps it's an indication of the current thinking in the sector at the moment. Let me just make one more comment, and my Deputy Vice Chancellor is here as well, Prof. Gwala, and the Director of Quality, and they will bear me out. For the last 3 or 4 years at DUT, Durban University of Technology, we embarked on a student-centeredness project, and of course this is not a case study about DUT, I should say that, but I just want to use it as an example. So a lot of the ideas that comes out in this presentation have been tested, and we're trying to make them work as well. So these are not just philosophical concepts, they are ideas that we're really serious about, that the Vice Chancellor is serious about, and we already are starting to see the rewards and in thinking in this way. So let me get cracking. All right. Yeah. Oh, I know. I'm trying to get to there. So, okay. You study that? Okay. All right. So I think whenever you talk about catalyzing student success or catalyzing for student success, we have to start with really, what is the purpose of higher education? And there's many books, we're all experts in the room here, I suppose, in answering this question. But I think we want to reinforce at least 5 ideas. The first one, building citizenry for a multi-layered complex democracy. So the first question I raised yesterday in our conversation, well, what do we mean by multi-layered complex democracy? Because the idea in most minds is that we do have democracy. And of course, this is not about the one person, one vote. It's really about participation at all levels. It's really about informed choice. It's really about having democracy in every strata and structure of our society. And we believe, or the Vice Chancellor believes, that this is one of the key purposes of a university. The second is broadening the intellectual culture of our society. To decrypt that a little bit, it's really about broadening the intellectual capacity right across society, not just amongst what we call intellectuals, but even people in the remotest of area, people in all aspects of business. And also it's across a range of disciplines. It's just not a technicist approach, but really engaging intellectual. It's having a kind of community or a society that always seeks to default to having an intellectual engagement about the problems, about whatever aspect we want to deal with. And then building the human resource needs of a complex economy. I suppose all economies are complex in nature, but the ideas of how do we get our students to be really agile? It's just not about adapting, but also adapting on time. How do we get them to engage in a range of disciplines? In engineering internationally, we embark on an exercise about graduate attributes. And interesting, I went to university in 1976. That was my first year. We never hear the word graduate attributes. Perhaps they didn't exist in those days. But when I compare what's happening globally to what happened in the past, we kind of figured out the graduate attributes once upon a time pertain really to the profession. And of course, when you look at the graduates now, it has very little to do with the profession the way it was defined in 1975. It's far more complex, and in fact, in many ways, it's also a little fuzzy as well. So that's the kind of idea that's coming through in this third point. So fourthly, it's about imagining and shaping a new nation. We still don't have a new nation in South Africa. I should tell you a story to explain this. A few weeks ago, we were doing an orientation for our international students. So part of the program was two of our alumni. One was in dental technology. I forget where the other one came from. And they sang a song. It's a song that they wrote. And so it's a kind of, it's a bit of a rap and a bit of folk. Beautiful words. And they get to the refrain, and it goes something like this. ... Our politicians are all colorblind. They only see black and white. And the song goes on. And I'm quoting them. And I thought, what a way to put it. And so that kind of indicated to me as well that we really do not, we have not really embarked on forming the new nation. And when I spoke to the Vice Chancellor about this, he went on and explained a bit more what that meant, but I think I've made the point. And then, of course, being bridges to the global community. When we get to the next slide, it's really about unpacking what we have said on the first slide. So what must universities do? And of course, the first one that comes to mind is build the capacity of students to learn continuously, actively, and independently. I think, Diane, you actually spoke quite a bit about this in the latter part of your slide, so I wouldn't touch on that too much, but there's a few other points that I think needs to be explained. Build the capacity to be tolerant, engaged citizens, and I guess that's in many of our teaching learning plans as well at universities. Build the general education basis of our students. And here I want to use an example from experience that we are engaged with at DUT as well. We have made it compulsory, for example, and this is a University of Technology, so I think it makes it more interesting, that there will be a core set of modules. So the artists will have to take mathematics, for example. The engineers and scientists will have to take drama or dance or whatever the curriculum calls for. There's a whole bouquet of courses that we have developed. And the idea is really about building the general basis, general education basis for our students. So we ask our students that come, have you heard of Jacques Mdao? Have you read any of his works? Nobody answers. These are South African students. And then next, to build their hard technical and intellectual skills at the same time. Because if we don't do that, when we get to the pragmatic world, we kind of see some of the problems we are seeing around. That links to another point that I will mention just now, but let me just get to the next one first. It's to build the employability and the entrepreneurship. Now, those 2 points might seem like it's too much of an instrumentalist approach. That's not the idea. The idea is to reach a balance between turning out a citizen or a graduate that could be both technically and professionally competent, but also building the general education basis of that particular graduate as well. And I think this will be expanded a little more as it goes on. And then, of course, building the capacity to be global citizens. And by that we mean being able to benchmark internationally, and I like the kind of idea that we have here, where we have folks from Scotland as well. By the way, my surname is Andrew, but I'm not from Scotland. I'm just a very happy South African. And also thinking globally as well at the same time. By the way, the arrows in my computer are on top. That is why I keep going to the top over there. So. And then we get to access and success. I think we all know that the current emphasis is on access. And we're not criticizing this. This is actually correct. But we have to ask some very pertinent questions. Access for what? Is it just to get a place for every student so that we can report on our data that the cohort in higher education has gone up by so much and so much? Access to what? Access to who, or to whom rather? We focus very much on young people, and we have to do this. But I think in a country such as South Africa, there's a whole cohort of people that have not been touched as yet. And it's our duty to to ask kind of questions, access to whom. It's just not about adult education either. And access to what end. And once again, we're not, or the Vice Chancellor is not suggesting an instrumentalist approach as well, but really asking the question, what really are we trying to achieve with the kind of access we are designing? And so here's a very controversial statement, and he warned me that this might create some problem amongst his colleagues at HESA. This is what he said. He said, once we understand these, we can begin to think about a contract between student and university. And I know that we all have contracts with our students, because when they register, they have to sign an administrative or legal contract. But I think it goes far beyond that, because once we really come to grips with the issues of access and success or teaching and learning, then the kind of contract should be a qualitative contract. The kind of contract should be very specific about democracy, about the rights of other students, about what we can do as a university, about learning outside of the classroom, and so forth and so forth. And I will touch a little bit on that just now, or perhaps in the next slide. So it's really about placing emphasis on success, and I think that's what your presentation was largely about as well, Diane. So we all know that students are whole people. But what if we said that students should really not be seen as students? I know it's cryptic, but I think our worldview on students is based on certain killer assumptions. And some killer assumption, one of the killer assumption is, well, we are here to teach. You have to do the learning on your own, which is actually quite true. But the way we unpack that and the way we practice the profession of teaching learning does not give us a kind of results. So it tells us there's something wrong. So most of the killer assumptions are historically based. And what we are saying in that statement is that we need to surface these killer assumptions and really determine our worldview or interrogate our worldview as to how we see students. So here's a rubric for student-centeredness. And believe you me, we still have not come to terms with what student-centeredness fully means. We have ideas, we have implemented certain aspects, but it's a kind of conversation that goes on and on and on, because there isn't one complete definition for student-centeredness. So who are students? And I will tell you that when we start to interview students like I do, when there are issues or just for the sake of interest, some of the stories that you hear is very different from what you would have perceived. And I guess that's true for most of our institutions as well. What do they come with? What have they read? What have they not read? The example of Jakes Mdow, the example of South African literature, for example. I just said on the radio this morning, I'm not too sure whether it was 702 or whether it was SAFM, because I switched between the two. One of the big issues in South Africa is that when you want to write in the vernacular, nobody wants to publish it. It's a serious problem. So you lose the richness in the translation, right? So what do we do about it? But there are university press that should not be really in the business of making only money. So why can't we use the university press to publish those books that want to be written or should be written in the vernacular, for example? What are the aspirations, and do they really fit? So the idea or the conclusion of that part of the presentation then is really about building the university around the needs of students so that they grow into independent learners. And we will expand this a little bit more in the last, this is my penultimate slide. So let's talk about integration of learning and living. We've coined the term hidden curriculum, or the hidden curricula, which is outside of the classroom learning. So it's really about what happens on campus, campus life, after hours, the weekends, and so forth and so forth. And if we understand that most learning happens outside of the classroom, the question is, do we really optimize that opportunity? And when you look at the state of some of our institutions, the answer is actually no. It's using ICT, and we deliberately used a word, or the Vice Chancellor, if I missed the slide over there. There we are. We're saying that ICT should be used as a disruptive technology. So what we are saying is that really ICT opens up new vistas. So what we need to do is to rethink and redesign the system and not just add on. Right now we add on ICT, you look at the old issue of MOOCs and all the online learning, the blended learning, so it's a kind of add-on. But how about stopping or sitting back and rethinking the effectiveness of technology and redesigning the system so that it becomes integrated. But it's really a disruptive technology. It changes the way we think about learning. It changes the way student thinks about learning. So it's really building new kinds of communication between professor and student, student and student, student and local network of students, and of course connecting them globally as well. Well, we should start where our students are. I'm one of those that actually do not like strategic plans, and I know the Vice Chancellor also do not like strategic plans. He's doing one because he has to do a strategic plan, because the council wants a strategic plan, and because the auditors want a strategic plan. Of course, I'm being a little facetious about that. But the whole idea of a strategic plan suggests that there are a certain number of interventions you can put in place that's going to give you the results. And they're very instrumentalist in its approach. It's kind of cause and effect. But the essence of universities with respect to teaching and learning, if you look how much of that is in most of the strategic plans, I think it raises a lot of questions. So what we are saying, or what the Vice Chancellor is saying, is that we really need to have a critical voice about the current reality with respect to where our students are. And we need to redesign the system so that we can compensate and mitigate the current reality so that we can have much better success. So it's not a reactive approach, it's not a blaming approach, but really coming to terms with where our students are at the moment. The next slide, I think this is my last slide. Well, it's not. We've just added the bit about general education, which I mentioned earlier on. So what does that mean for academics? It means that we need to address the mindsets and attitudes, qualifications, perhaps not all universities, but quite a few in the country, and get them to start building empathy. Academic innovation, it's really about creating the capacity of academics to innovate, to build new approaches to learning, to draw new technologies. And I think the presentation that you made, Diane, as well alludes to this. This is what you're trying to figure out in the data and in the quality enhancement project. I think most people actually like the word audit. It's easier when you have an audit, right? It's a matter of compliance. But what you have here, it really makes you think. It goes right down to the heart of the matter, and you can't get away from it. It's not about compliance. It's really about justifying what's in your inner core, what's in your inner mind. And this is the kind of picture or the idea Ahmed Bawa is trying to put across as well. Student support, finally. It's really about helping students to overcome difficulties outside of the classroom that impinge on their academic success. So here's a thought. A lot of emphasis and interest is placed on first-time higher education students. We kind of, at my orientation, how many of you here are really the first-timers in your family? Nobody else in your family or extended family has been to university. A lot of hands go up. How about first-time city students? And perhaps Minister Blade's comment is right about accommodation and residence when he says it should be increased. Because the fact of the matter is, in most of our universities, we have rural students coming to the city. So the idea is, in the rural areas, you should have residences, for example, and that's right, because you do not have enough accommodation. But the assumption is simply because perhaps 80% of our students come from rural areas into the cities, and because the cities we do not have to provide accommodation, we need to start thinking about that. We don't know what the answer to that is, but that's just a thought, and that's just an example of how we should really rethink about how we help students to overcome difficulties outside of the classroom that impinge on their academic success. I hope I have covered all these points. If they were too cryptic, we can have a chat later on. We did go through this in quite detail, but that's the essence of this talk. Thank you very much.